It was launched by a handwritten memo and made its first home in buildings no one else wanted. But there was no denying the vision of its founders or the hard work of thousands of men and women who for over 60 years have built on that vision. And today, the Defense Logistics Agency carries on a legacy that is forged by history and focused on the future. As the 1960s approached, there was a sea of change taking place. America's star was rising. Innovation was key to productivity. The country was breaking into new frontiers and moving to a different beat. But the armed services were stuck in a pattern. Military logistical support organizations were still as they had been for a century and a half, separate from each other, and each with its own way of doing things.
Before DLA, each service had its own supply system, its own logistics system, its own depot system, its own communication system. And they used to come up with a cry, which is a very valid cry: why don't we have one item, one supply demand control point for everybody? Well, that's almost cause for revolution.
The election of President Kennedy ushered in a new style of leadership, and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, called for a new approach to logistics. On October 1st, 1961, he created the Defense Supply Agency. Within DoD, but separate from the armed services, DSA had a single mission: provide the U.S. military with world-class logistical support at a cost taxpayers could afford. Many doubted that any organization made up largely of civilians could handle the challenge. In 1961, Major General Andrew T. McNamara, a combat quartermaster during World War II, was made Deputy Commanding General of the 8th U.S. Army stationed in Korea. He expected his tour to last a full year, but it was cut short by a cable from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Andrew McNamara was needed back in the States to serve as the first director of the new Defense Supply Agency, later to become the Defense Logistics Agency.
Dad and Mom both talked to me about being the first director of Defense Supply Agency. Dad from one standpoint, Mom from another. Dad mostly from the standpoint of trying to start from scratch to organize and get into motion on a very quick notice a new agency in Washington. He was assigned, temporary barracks, and in order to get people to come to work, he sometimes had to escort the women from their cars in the parking lot into their offices and then out. As the director, the rats were so big that the ladies were scared to even work there. My mother told me that he had lost a lot of friends and a lot of acquaintances because that he accepted this job as the first director, and that even as the ex-quartermaster general, he was a Judas Iscariot for taking it because of the missions that would be usurped from the various other Army, Navy, and Air Force. But Dad accepted the task, the responsibilities, and knew and felt that it was the right thing to do to save money and to be a single manager and single ownership of all of these things.
Many doubted that any organization made up largely of civilians, even serving side by side with military personnel, could handle the challenge, and many more disagreed about how things should be done.
DSA at the time, the Defense Supply Agency, was almost a sleepy backwater little agency compared to what it is today. We had half a dozen distribution depots, some consumable items, not all. Some contract management, not all. And We never really got the exposure at the highest levels of the Department of Defense that we get today.
There were still rivalries that existed among people who had worked for the Army, or they'd worked for the Navy, or they'd worked for the Air Force, and you'd have conversations that were peppered with, the Air Force did it this way, and that's a better way than you're proposing now.
DSA's mission was to build the logistics system of the future, but the work environment was anything but futuristic.
The ceiling was made of parachutes draped and hung from the ceiling of the warehouse. And of course, electrical cords and the phone cords hung down from the ceiling onto your desk.
The floors were checkerboard, black and white tile over concrete, the coldest, hardest floors you can ever imagine. Gray, ugly desks that half the drawers didn't work, file cabinets that came from warehouses where half the drawers wouldn't close, let alone a lock. And even more funny is the wiring coming out of the ceiling looked like we were tied to our desk.
They had smoking at that time in the office space. By mid-afternoon, you'd see this cloud hanging about 6 feet above the floor.
In the 1960s, the U.S. launched the first American into space, and the entire country saw a bright future ahead. Right from the start, the new agency had its hands full. It was given management of 8 operations previously run by the armed services, in the hope that it might save the government $30 million each year. In hardly any time at all, General McNamara and his team were far exceeding those expectations. Within 6 months, 3 more centers joined the fold, and DSA's workforce grew to more than 16,000 employees. By the end of its second year, the agency was managing over 1 million different items and an inventory of $2.5 billion. The young agency was thriving and facing its first real logistics challenge while proving itself ready and able.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was an almost overnight change in the atmosphere because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a surprise and the intelligence was passed around. Of course, we had different secret and top secret security measures at that time. I was a secretary and my typewriter ribbon was cloth, and so it had to be taken out of the typewriter and locked up at night in a secure area. And because we were managing photographic supplies and the reconnaissance film that was used for those reconnaissance flights was taken out of the warehouses here.
In the mid-1960s, big changes were taking place in U.S. culture, and DSA's employees were changing with the times.
When I first came to work here, I guess in the middle of the civil rights movement, some changes have been made to better things for blacks. The bathrooms and the doors entering the bathrooms and all had been painted over, but you could still see the letters, white only and color was on the doors.
A lineup of nimble knees shows that the hem has risen to a point of no return.
When the miniskirts came in, there was a limit to how short your miniskirt could be.
All the men wore white shirts, dark ties. All the women wore dresses or suits. No one wore pants to work during that time. I remember wearing a pantsuit to work for the first time and felt quite uncomfortable.
Everyday life may have been changing by leaps and bounds in the 1960s, but the war in Vietnam continued to dominate the headlines, and the team at DSA continued to work tirelessly to support the U.S. troops.
It was combat-oriented, and we had to be a lot faster on our feet, get stuff moving to the people in the field a lot faster than we did, and develop better ideas.
I remember once an officer called me. It was during the Vietnam era, and I could hear the bombs in the background. And he wanted to know where his shipment was at, that his people needed these medical supplies. And so I was like, oh my God, you know. And I go, can I call you back? He goes, no, I'll call you back.
Between 1965 and 1969, DSA delivered more than 22 million tons of dry cargo and 14 million tons of bulk petroleum to Vietnam. And the agency's total procurement soared past $6 billion. To manage this surge in volume, DSA acquired 5 more Army and Navy depots, completing the vast depot network that served the agency's customers well into the 1990s, and began merging operations as a first step toward the streamlined organization of today. The agency was also charged with administering the most defense contracts, and almost overnight, the agency's mission expanded from strictly supply operations into providing full logistics services.
We're transitioning into supplying the theater with refrigerated vans rather than break bulk ships. And eventually we phased the banana boats out and relied upon containerized refrigerated vans. We were able to send California, Arizona grown iceberg lettuce to Vietnam and have it arrive there in absolutely wonderful shape.
I remember sitting there working. You had all of these little blanks you had to fill in manually, pencil and pen, filling out the worksheets to make an award. And then once I finished it, if I'm the buyer, then I would pass it on to the contracting officer, and that person would take his or her pen and go over to make sure that every thing that's required on that document was required, and was all done manually, pencil and pen.
The 1970s saw people hustling to the dance floor and the end of the Vietnam War. And DSA was going through its own brand of change. The agency established the Defense Property Disposal Service in Battle Creek, Michigan, to help dispose of assets returning from Vietnam, and acquired worldwide responsibility for procuring and managing food items and bulk energy products in support of U.S. warfighters overseas. As the agency's workload had grown, technology had become increasingly important, and the technology that proved most important was the DLA Standard Automated Material Management System, more commonly known as SAMS.
We got up to 1 million items of supply, and pretty much with the same amount of people. So if it wasn't for automation, there was no way you would be able to process that kind of volume in the almost real-time frames. So we had more opportunities to be creative. SAMS proved itself, it worked.
And creativity was a necessity, especially as DSA found itself facing new challenges.
The energy crisis in the 70s was certainly a defining moment. I mean, not only for the country, but certainly for us in DFSC at the time. When the Arab nations boycotted and cut production in '73, the most noticeable thing from everyone's perspective, I guess, was the price of oil just went through the roof. We saw prices that were unheard of prior to that time. We had some very close calls in terms of being able to meet mission. I know at one point on the east coast of the United States, we were down to about 5 days of supply of jet fuel for the Navy, a very precarious situation. We never failed to supply fuel that was needed for a mission.
So one interesting thing was the Secretary of Defense decided he would meet with all the major oil companies at the time. There were 6 or 7 of them. And I got to attend that meeting behind closed doors. But what he was trying to do was convince them to bid more on our contracts so that we wouldn't have as much trouble meeting our demand.
And finally, in 1977, the agency's name was changed to reflect the full scope of its services to the United States and its military forces. For most Americans, the 1980s meant Ronald Reagan as president and the Berlin Wall tumbling down. But the 80s also saw DLA's business increase and change, technology coming into the workplace, assuming disposal of DoD's hazardous and toxic materials, earning its designation by Congress as a combat support agency, and assuming management of the nation's stockpile of strategic materials.
We had no computers until the early 80s, I think it was. And at the time, we had one computer per bay of the building. So you might have like 100 people sharing one computer, and your team had an assigned time. So if nobody from your team went and used the computer, then you lost your time.
Big change that occurred when I was comptroller was the Department of Defense established the DBOF, Defense Business Operations Fund, now known as Working Capital Fund. That was a very significant change because it changed the way DLA was funded. It changed the ability of DLA to make good decisions on how they bought product and how they managed the organization. But what it really did is the use of a cost recovery rate focused the customer on how much DLA costs them to do the work that they could otherwise do for themselves. And that made DLA focus real heavily on cost, on reducing the cost of doing business.
The 1990s saw the introduction of the World Wide Web and mobile phones to the average person. For the U.S. military, it was about a Gulf War and a mission to the Balkans. As it turned out, all of DLA's growth and achievements in the 1980s were preparation for what would prove to be a tough test for the agency.
In the early 90s, Disposition Service was trying to promote itself to its customers to do things more cost-effective. We stumbled across this thing called web technology. So we were talking to different universities that were kind of involved in the development of this technology. And we stumbled across the University of Switzerland that actually had the software we could download. And right after we got it running, we realized its potential. We were one of the first on the internet to have a searchable database online. We had a group of customers that were in here, and we asked them what they would like to see in a searchable database, if it would make their job easier. They were all in agreement it would. So a gentleman came and he sat down. He typed in his search, and I was watching it. It took about 4 minutes for it to come back. And as soon as the search came back, he picked up the telephone next to the terminal and he called our Fort Lewis office and told them he wanted all 24,000 pair. And I had this puzzled look on my face. I'm going, what are you going to do with 24,000 pair of extra large boxer shorts? And he smiled at me and he says, they're for the homeless. We had a group from DLA headquarters that came down. I demoed the product to them. They really pleased with what it looked like, but at the end they said, Rod, it was a great demo, but it'll never catch on. And we just smiled, and I said, may we continue with our research? And they said, of course, it doesn't cost us anything. It speaks for itself now.
We didn't have any sand-colored camouflage uniforms in the military to talk of at all. We're talking huge numbers of troops that went to the desert. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but at least 500,000 troops we sent over there. And we didn't have, 3 sets of desert uniforms for all those folks. So we had to get cranking on that. And our little clothing factory right there on post, our 1,200 wonderful people that worked over there, jumped to that thing. We were producing 100 sets of camouflage uniforms a day while we were working to bring the contractors online, the big manufacturers.
One of my main memories is when it was Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and we were providing the equipment for the soldiers to deploy. And there was a shortage of Kevlar helmets. And Clothing and Textiles was the agency, the supply chain responsible for those helmets. And we were literally supplying helmets as soldiers were getting on the plane to deploy, and some soldiers would have to stay back because we just didn't have the helmets to give them.
I was in DLA Europe during the Bosnia operation from 1994 to approximately 1999. And during that time, information operations, we had to deploy our own network for DLA. So we brought our desktop computers with us, the Ethernet cables, the satellite kit, and we deployed the network and got the communication set up for the contingency team so that they could communicate back to what was at the time SAMS.
Desert Storm taught Team DLA many lessons, and the result was the agency taking a major leap into adopting the best business practices of leading commercial companies. This enabled DLA to not only improve its existing services, but also expand its role in emergency assistance and contingency support efforts.
Back in the 80s, we were basically following a business model that had been put in place for over a century, which was buying product and sending it to a warehouse. So we would buy bulk coffee, we would buy bulk sugar, send it to the warehouse, and then the warehouse would break it down and send those products to the DFACs worldwide. So the inventory model and so forth was really something that just we kept doing because that's how we had supported the troops for many, many years, including up and through Vietnam. So one of the things that we looked at in those early days, we got looking at how the commercial sector provided product. That was the start of the re-engineering of the business processes that we, up until this day, we continue with many, many generations each time trying to continuously improve the product and solution for the warfighter.
Another major change for DLA in the 1990s was moving DLA headquarters from its World War II offices to more modern quarters at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. In the 2000s, we ushered in a new millennium, witnessed the tragedy of 9/11, and watched as a massive hurricane caused devastating disaster. Always dedicated to supporting the nation, DLA employees stepped up like never before to fight the war on terror and take on new missions like providing supplies to battle wildland fires and humanitarian disasters. In addition, Team DLA pursued a major undertaking to update its business systems.
Well, DDXX is DLA Distribution Expeditionary. It came up to be after the devastation that Hurricane Katrina brought the U.S. back in 2005. FEMA asked Department of Defense on how Department of Defense would be able to support FEMA with regards to future natural disasters.
We went to Bagram, Afghanistan. There's not a site, there's not anything. We're living in 20 by 40 wooden bee huts. And the lead individual that knew about sites and such, his back went out. Within a month, his back went out. So that left myself and another individual. He was a GS7 that was very, very experienced as far as sites are concerned. You know, forklift driver, really knew that kind of thing, but not the other. So we just started pulling out the manual. We went page by page and we figured it out. And when we opened the gates to say, hey, you know, here's DRMO Bagram and we're open.
We invaded Iraq in 2003. From that point until around 2007, U.S. was taking a lot of casualties from what was called IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. Our up-armored Humvees, even though they were up-armored and just our soft-skinned vehicles, just were no match for these IEDs. In 2007, the Secretary of Defense made a commitment to start developing and deploying mine resistance armor protection devices, or MRAPs, and putting those in the field so we can protect our soldiers and allow people to come home.
So we would get these emergency requests from theater where we would then have to go through kind of a mini version of that process. We would then coordinate with the service to say, okay, is this part number correct for this item, and is it used here on the vehicle? Do you have any technical data that we can use for it? If this is needed, then as soon as they say yes, go ahead and assign it. We then assign it, get the information back to the warfighter so they know what they can start ordering in terms of a stock number.
And when you're rolling out a big system like BSN, you've really got to be synchronized and aligned every day. And so we began to gather in the evenings, and it was only us, no one else. And we worked through things, and I believe really created a high-performing organization as a result of that.
In the 2010s, the world saw social media explode, causing connection and chaos. the war on terror continued, and DLA took a bigger role in supporting relief of humanitarian missions and natural disasters, while still supporting our warfighters and the nation.
When I became the J7 director, one of the actions going on was OUA Liberia. We had the Ebola crisis there. And so our contractor, again, we were called in at the tail end of the challenge, and so we had a contract for scrap that was generated, but then we also had a contract for the hazardous waste. And that can be also challenging, trying to find adequate storage facilities that meet U.S. criteria in a third world country.
And then on top of Harvey hit the other 3 hurricanes right after it, so we were busy. And we would work till late at night, sometimes 10 o'clock at night, sometimes midnight. That's not uncommon. What happens is if a field site comes in with items that we need, because we'll send out items needed. The field site comes back and we'll go check with the customer, say, do you need it? If yes, they bring it on record. Well, as soon as they bring it on record, we must put that order in after 5 p.m. each day when the inventory updates. So that wasn't even a requirement. We don't think twice about it. It's just something we do. It's your job, and you're glad to help. And anything we can do to help, it makes you glad that you have the job that you have.
As DLA settles into the 2020s, the agency continues to evolve into a world-class organization and embrace innovation to better support the warfighter and the nation.
Well, in my mind, the idea of the readiness dashboard and the agency synchronization and operations center were inseparable. Operations also involves procurement. It also involves distribution. It involves disposition services. It also has to be tied to our energy enterprise. And so all of that had to come together in one place within this agency. I felt that it was the next evolution in DLA becoming even more effective, to get all of those capabilities into one place, to manage this enterprise and to look at our key performance metrics, not on a quarterly basis, not on a monthly basis, but the ability to take a look at them every single day, tied to the readiness support that we provide to the services.
The early 2020s found Team DLA once again facing a challenge that would test the world's resilience and strength. The global pandemic was yet another opportunity for the agency to shine and be recognized for its logistics savvy in supporting the warfighter and the nation.
We were 16 to 18-hour days right from the get-go, and what we found is that the United States needed a lot of personal protective equipment. It needed ventilators, needed pharmaceuticals to combat COVID. What we found, though, unfortunately, is that at least when it came to PPE, 85% of it was made overseas. And as you can imagine, if they weren't fighting COVID themselves, well, that probably wouldn't have been a problem. But they were.
We have a lot of relationships with not only DoD, but other federal agencies, over 40 federal agencies. So a lot of those agencies, both HHS and FEMA, were very well aware of our capabilities. As they were tasked, and as we found, no one was really fully prepared for this pandemic. There was an immediate gravitation to, hey, we've worked with DLA before. DLA, are there things you can do to help us with providing medical supplies, transportation capability, acquisition capability? And so that's really how it became an agency effort in support of not only the warfighter and DoD, but for the nation.
History only takes shape with the clarity of hindsight. The relics that make a decade memorable aren't always obvious until long after it has passed. Any doubt that an organization made up largely of civilians could handle the logistics challenge is long gone. As DLA grows and changes with the times, one thing is certain: Team DLA will remain dedicated, bold, and steadfast in meeting the mission. DLA, forged by history, focused on the future.